Good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Robert Hazel and I'm a professor in the School of Public Policy and Director of the Constitution Unit here at UCL. Over the years we've done a lot of work on Scottish devolution and Scottish independence. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister in Scotland, to give tonight's lecture. Her timing is impeccable. As you will all know, today was the day the gloves finally came off in the independence debate, with George Osborne's speech this morning rejecting the possibility of an independent Scotland joining a currency union with the UK. So this evening is Nicola's chance to respond on that and many other issues by outlining her vision for an independent Scotland, which was set out in detail in the Scottish Government's very impressive white paper published last November. And the form tonight is that Nicola will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, thus allowing plenty of time for questions, but we must finish 5 or 10 minutes before 6:30 to allow her to catch a plane. But I hope everyone else here will be able to join us for a drink afterwards across the road in the cloisters. Nicola, thank you very much for coming tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Robert, for that very kind invitation. If I'd known there was a drink on offer, I'd have booked a later plane. Obviously, I have to let you into a secret. The impeccable timing that Robert referred to there today was all the result of very careful planning. George and I had a conversation last week and said, how are we going to make this UCL lecture as topical as possible? And I said, well, George, if you just come to Edinburgh and do a speech and I go down to Leeds. So it was all perfectly planned, as I'm sure you realised this morning. It is a real pleasure to be here in London and to be here at UCL to set out the case for Scotland becoming an independent member of the family of nations that make up the British Isles. The decision that Scotland will take on the 18th of September is one that, rightly and practically, can only be taken by people living in Scotland. That said, those of us who argue for a yes vote are acutely aware, and I personally am very acutely aware, that the decision we take will impact on our friends and neighbours across the whole United Kingdom. And as I'll set out later, I believe that impact will be a positive one. But in the interconnected world that we live in, it is, I think, very important, very, very important for all of us who want Scotland to become independent to set out the basis of our case, not just within Scotland, but also to the rest of the UK and indeed to the wider world. Above all, it's important for us to be crystal clear to the people of England, Wales and Northern Ireland that our case is not, emphatically not, separatist or insular. Nor is it in any way, shape or form driven by antipathy towards or resentment of our neighbours in the rest of the UK. Instead, the case that we make is based on a desire to be responsible, to stand on our own 2 feet, to make and be accountable for our own decisions, but also to be a good neighbour making a positive contribution to the world that we live in. Last week, the Prime Minister made a speech about the bonds that exist between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Much of the commentary around that speech, certainly in Scotland, centred on the fact that he chose to make his case in the Olympic Stadium in London rather than head-to-head in debate with Alex Salmond. But I want to leave that to one side for now. The fact is that I, the granddaughter of an Englishwoman, absolutely agree with the Prime Minister that the bonds of history, family, trade and culture that exist between Scotland and the rest of the UK are strong and they are precious. This university is a living example of our shared heritage. Two of UCL's, I suppose what you could call founding fathers, the poet Thomas Campbell and the lawyer and MP Henry Broome, were Scots. I'm sure nobody here will mind me pointing out that when UCL was founded back in 1826, it became only the third university in England. whereas by then Scotland already had 5, including my own university, Glasgow. I also have to say, I suspect that his association with this university would be a much prouder claim to fame for Henry Broome than the fact that he, to this day, I understand, holds the record for the longest ever speech in the House of Commons. On the 7th of February 1828, he spoke for 6 hours on the scintillating subject of law reform. I'm a lawyer as well by background, but I'll only do about 4 or 5 tonight, if that's okay. But the point I'm making, and it's a point that will run through everything I say to you this evening, is that the social union that exists between Scotland and the other nations of the UK is strong and it will endure. Scots have and will no doubt continue to seek out fame and fortune in this thriving cosmopolitan city, just as people born in England, Wales and Northern Ireland will continue to make their homes in Scotland, and in doing so will enrich our country and our culture. We'll continue to trade with each other, we'll share the ups and downs of our common history, we'll enjoy the intricacies of family connection, we'll cheer on Andy Murray and Mo Farah. Who knows, we might even back each other at football, or I'm maybe taking this a bit too far at this point. But the fact is, these bonds were forged not by governments or constitutions, but over generations by my ancestors and yours, by people who inhabited the same islands. And the strength and depth of these bonds mean that they don't depend on Scotland continuing to be governed by Westminster. On the contrary, I believe, and I believe it very strongly, that the relationship between the countries and the peoples of these islands will be strengthened with Scotland as an equal partner, an independent nation taking responsibility for our own decisions and not having anybody else to blame when things go wrong. So the case for independence that I'll set out for you this evening rests on 3 key arguments. Firstly, that Scotland can be a successful independent country. Our economy and our public finances are strong. We are well prepared for taking on the responsibilities of independence, and our proposals on issues such as currency and continuing membership of the European Union make sense. They make sense for us and they make sense for our neighbours. They are well thought through, rational and reasonable. They represent what will be the common sense outcome of the negotiations that will follow a yes vote in September. Secondly, I'll contend that Scotland should, I would say, must become an independent country. It is, to me, a statement of the obvious that our interests will be better served by decisions taken in our own Parliament rather than at Westminster by governments that are all too often at odds with the political instincts of the majority of people living in Scotland. Moreover, I believe that independence will better equip us to face up to and address the challenges that we undoubtedly face as a country. And thirdly, I'll argue that independence for Scotland will be good for our relationship with the other nations of the UK. In fact, I'll go further and venture to argue that an independent Scotland would be good for and should be embraced by all those across the UK who want to see progressive change. But first, let me start with a point of agreement in the debate. Scotland can be a successful independent country. Last week, the Financial Times said this: among the blizzard of contention and spin that surrounds the independence debate, some points of broad consensus are clear. The leading players on both sides accept that Scotland has all the ingredients to be a viable nation-state. It went on to note that with a geographic share of North Sea oil and gas, an independent Scotland's GDP per head would be higher than that of France. We'd be in the top 20 countries in the world in terms of GDP per head and the top 50 in terms of GDP overall. Quite something for a country of just 5 million people. We'd also be one of the world's top 35 exporters. And as the FT also pointed out, while spending per head is higher in Scotland than in the rest of the UK, so too is revenue. The gap between spending and revenue, in other words, our deficit, is actually smaller than in the UK as a whole. Indeed, we've generated more revenue than the UK average in each and every single one of the past 32 years. So our public finances are relatively strong, or to put it again in the words of the Financial Times, an independent Scotland could expect to start with healthier state finances than the rest of the UK. We've also got a resilient and a diverse economy with key strengths in areas like food and drink, tourism, creative industries, life sciences, financial services and manufacturing. We've got more universities per head of population in the Times top 200 than any other nation in the world. So there's broad agreement, consensus even, something that's rare in the independence debate, on Scotland's fundamental economic and financial viability as an independent state. But the case that Scotland can be independent is not just based on economics and finances. The experience of devolution has shown us that taking decisions in Scotland rather than at Westminster on health, on education, on justice works. It's brought real benefits for people living in Scotland. Devolution has also demonstrated that we can run our own affairs competently. Successive Scottish governments have found the resources to deliver our policy priorities from within a balanced budget. Some would say we have legally no choice, and that is true, but nevertheless we've exerted the discipline to do so. We've reformed our National Health Service in a way that is consistent with our political views and traditions, opting not to follow the privatisation that has taken place elsewhere in these islands. The Scottish Parliament itself has proved itself to be an open and accessible legislature, widely admired for its modern, inclusive approach, and we've developed an international presence and reputation on certain key issues. Our climate change legislation, for example, led the world. So that experience of devolution is important, and it's now being brought to bear in our planning for independence. The white paper that Robert referred to is the most detailed blueprint ever produced for any country moving towards independence. And it is one of many documents published by the Scottish Government to inform the debate. The Independent Fiscal Commission Working Group, which includes 2 Nobel laureates in economics, has produced detailed proposals for the macroeconomic framework of an independent Scotland, including a currency union. It's considered in detail the fiscal rules that would be required to make such a monetary union work, preempting the points that were, I thought, very sensibly made by the Governor of the Bank of England in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago. It's also published detailed proposals for a modern and efficient tax system and for an oil fund to ensure that we are responsible in our stewardship of the remaining oil and gas reserves that remain in the North Sea. The Scottish Government has also produced detailed papers on membership of the European Union. We've appointed expert commissions on welfare and on energy markets. These commissions have and will continue to inform the development of our proposals. So we are prepared. We've done and are doing the work. We know how to make the transition from where we are now to Scotland as an independent nation. Now, of course, if Scotland votes yes in September, as I hope it will, some matters, some big matters, will require negotiation. But of course, because something lies in the future and requires agreement, doesn't mean that we can't make reasonable and confident judgments about the outcome. For example, I think everyone accepts that Scotland will be in the European Union and that it will be in everyone's interest to make sure our transition to independent membership happens seamlessly. Indeed, there's a growing sense in Scotland that the only real threat to our membership of the European Union would be in the event of a no vote and the in-out referendum that is planned by David Cameron for 2017. But that threat aside, it's inconceivable that the European Union, an institution that exists to bring down barriers between countries, would want to exclude Scotland, or that the rest of the UK, which coexists quite happily with the Republic of Ireland in a borderless common travel area, would insist on anything different in its relationship with Scotland. And we're also confident, despite the renewed sabre rattling of the No campaign that's been hitting the headlines today, that a currency union can be agreed, not just because the pound belongs to Scotland as much as it does to the rest of the UK and the Bank of England is a shared asset, but more importantly, because a sterling zone, underpinned by the appropriate institutional arrangements to make it work, will serve the economic, financial and trading interests of the rest of the UK as much as it will Scotland's. Now, politicians on the no side of this debate will, of course, tell you something different. It's their right to do so. They will argue that after 300 years, Scotland is entitled to nothing from the UK except a share of the debt, begging the question of why we would want to stay in a union that treated us with such contempt. They want people to believe that there will be border posts between Scotland and England, even though there are none between the UK and Ireland. They suggest that Scotland would have to leave the European Union only to rejoin later, some kind of supranational hokey-cokey. They say all of these things because it is in their vested interest to create a climate of fear and uncertainty. They know, I think, that their positions lack credibility, but they repeat them anyway, and then wonder why their campaign is losing ground. And I think nothing demonstrates this more starkly than the position on currency outlined this morning by George Osborne, a position that I predict will backfire on the No campaign. I think it's a panicked reaction to shifting polls, to a narrowing of the position in Scotland. Smacks a little bit of bullying and intimidation, and believe me, people in Scotland will not take kindly to being bullied by George Osborne. But worst of all, I think it's a bluff, and I think people know it. Because whatever George Osborne might like to think, we're not actually daft. Now, the fact is, Westminster can't stop Scotland using the pound. It is, after all, a fully tradable currency. But more to the point, a UK government that decided against a currency union would put itself at odds with majority public opinion in Scotland, and according to a recent poll in England as well. It would cost English businesses hundreds of millions of pounds in transaction costs. It would blow a hole worth tens of billions of pounds in the UK balance of payments. And since the sharing of assets and liabilities do go hand in hand, it would potentially leave Westminster shouldering the entirety of UK debt, which is not incidentally a position that is advocated by the Yes side. But all of these consequences would flow from any absurd decision on the part of Westminster to refuse a currency union. That's the reality. It's no doubt why Alistair Darling, not a Yes supporter in case you haven't noticed, said himself that if Scotland was to become independent, a currency union would be, and I quote, logical and desirable. And it's why, regardless of what is said now in the heat of a campaign, the Treasury position will be very different after the reality of a yes vote. The fact is that people know that if Scotland votes yes, we will have done so peacefully, democratically and constitutionally. And while there will be big issues to negotiate and to resolve, it will at that point be in the overwhelming interests of all concerned for sensible agreement to be reached. The heat of the campaign will give way to mutual self-interest and to hard common sense. So my first proposition this evening is that Scotland can both become and be a successful independent country. We know how to do it, and we have common sense solutions to the practical issues we face. The real question we face in Scotland is not whether we can, but whether we should become an independent country. I argue that we should, because I firmly believe that those of us who live and work in Scotland are the best people to take decisions about our future. We are the best qualified to know what we need and want, and because we will have to live with the outcomes, we have the greatest incentive to make the right decisions. In short, independence means that we will stand on our own 2 feet, take responsibility for ourselves, and have no one else to blame if things go wrong. Independence, in my view, will better equip us to face up to the challenges of the future. I said earlier on that we would have the strongest possible starting point as an independent country, and that is true. But the choice we face in the referendum is about the future. Like other countries, we face some big challenges: constrained public finances, a legacy of debt. We face a need to boost our working population. But these are not arguments against independence. These are products of the status quo. They're reasons not to keep things as they are, but to do things differently. We need to grow our economy faster in Scotland. We need to be more competitive. We need to expand our working age population and in doing so raise the revenue that will support the public services that we value. As part of the current system, and despite everything we have going for us, we haven't performed as well as many of our similar-sized independent competitors. Our independent neighbours have grown their economies, they've grown their populations more quickly than we have. And the benefit of independence is we get our hands on the tools we need to seek to improve our performance in these crucial areas. We could, for example, choose to transform childcare, building on the improvements we've been able to deliver with the limited powers of devolution. In the Independence White Paper, we set out a long-term plan for the provision of free universal childcare for all children from the age of 1 to school age at 5. At present, childcare costs in Scotland are among the highest in Europe. They present a real barrier to parents, women in particular, pursuing fulfilling careers, getting back into the workplace. And yet we know that if we can raise female participation in the labour market to levels achieved in Sweden, for example, then as well as the boost to general economic performance, we would also generate something like an additional £700 million per year in tax revenue, money that in an independent Scotland could stay in Scotland to help fund the policy for the long term. When you operate within a fixed block grant, as we do now, you don't benefit from the increased tax revenues that are generated by sensible economic policies that you implement. That money goes to the pocket of George Osborne. So right now, no devolved Scottish Government could make a big commitment like that without making big cuts elsewhere. It is a social and economic transformation that is only possible when we control both tax and spending. We could also ensure with independence that we have an approach to immigration that meets our needs, not one that panders to UKIP. Our demographics mean that for Scotland, sensible migration is an opportunity, not a threat. It's vital that we grow our population if we are to grow our economy, if we are to protect our welfare state. Sensible migration, along with more women in the workforce, more of our own young people able to stay and access good jobs in Scotland, is important for our future. The economic powers of independence would also equip us to compete more effectively with the centre of economic gravity that is this city. London is a wonderful city, one of the great global centres of human culture, industry, achievement. The energy of London, its multiculturalism, the intensity of life here, all of that is what I and so many other people love about this city. But the reality is, from the Prime Minister down, there's a recognition that too much economic activity is concentrated in London and the South East. David Cameron said that such a narrow foundation for growth was unstable. But this is a trend that has continued and is continuing under successive Westminster administrations. It's accelerating. The gap in economic performance between regions in the UK is larger than in any other European country. In practical terms, that means jobs and opportunities are increasingly concentrated here. Indeed, just before Christmas, Vince Cable said, rather unkindly I thought, that London was like a suction machine draining the life out of the rest of the country. So where does Scotland fit into that picture of unequal economic growth and job opportunities? Well, I know exactly where I don't want us to be. I don't want us to be sitting on the periphery, gurning about it and blaming London for having the temerity to be successful. I want us to be competitive. I want Scotland to have the ability to seek to emulate and not resent the best that you have to offer. And because of the economic strengths we have, and I would argue because of the action that the Scottish Parliament has taken over many years, we've performed better than any other part of the UK outside of London and the South East. But we can do better if we become a national economy with the full range of economic powers to take advantage of the inherent strengths we have. Another key argument for independence is it will address the democratic deficit at the heart of how we're currently governed. The current Westminster government consists of parties that came third and fourth in the general election in Scotland. The coalition is currently led by the Tories, who in the last 4 UK general elections have won in order 0, 1, 1 and 1 Westminster seats in Scotland. Now, it was the impact of the democratic deficit throughout the 1980s and 1990s that led in no small way to the establishment of our own Parliament. But today Westminster still makes the big decisions on our economy, the shape of our welfare state, on whether nuclear weapons should continue to be based in close proximity to our largest city. And today we have a Westminster government led by a party with one MP in Scotland that is yet again imposing policies like the bedroom tax that have little support in Scotland, a government that is embracing austerity not through necessity but by ideological choice, a government that seems intent on dismantling the very foundations of the post-war welfare state. All of that puts the democratic deficit centre stage again, with opinion growing that the only way to address it once and for all is to complete the powers of our Parliament through independence. And while I'm on the subject of democracy, let me just address one particular myth about Scottish independence, and that is that if Scotland was to become independent, we are somehow condemning the rest of the UK to one-party rule. In fact, in only 2 of the 18 general elections that have taken place since 1945, October 1964 and February 1974, would the largest party at Westminster have been different if Scotland had been independent and not returned any MPs to Westminster. And the governments that were elected on these occasions lasted for less than 26 months in total. So votes in Scotland rarely affect the outcome of UK general elections. Scotland, as part of the UK, has virtually no influence on the make-up or the direction of Westminster governments. We do have to live with the policies they implement, though. But it is possible that an independent Scotland could be a progressive beacon for those in the rest of the UK who, like us, crave a different direction to the one set by the Westminster establishment. And that brings me to the third and last of the arguments I want to put forward to you this evening. And that is that the rest of the UK has nothing to fear, and I would argue much to gain from Scotland becoming independent. Those who've followed the referendum debate, those who are following the referendum debate, will have noticed that one of the claims that the No campaign makes is that Westminster decision-making means a pooling of resources and a sharing of risk across the UK, and they often hold up the welfare state and the NHS as examples of the pooling of resources. I think it's their attempt at positive campaigning, but it is, I think, an argument built on sand, because people can see with their own eyes that Westminster isn't sharing resources and pooling risk. Instead, the resources are being taken away and the risk is being borne by the poor and the vulnerable. And the very institutions that they seek to use to build support for continued Westminster government, the NHS and the welfare state, are being undermined by Westminster. We've already seen the return of the means test for child benefit, the iniquitous bedroom tax, and cuts to the income of the working poor. And it's not just the cuts themselves that are destroying the safety net on which I believe we should all be able to depend in times of need. It's also the rhetoric of scrounger and striver, the abandonment of the universal principle. It's the politics of division from those who claim that they're trying to keep people together. And we see that division in the fragmentation of the health service in England. We hear warnings that the Tories are intent on wholesale privatisation of the NHS, that English hospitals are asking for credit cards before they give care. If the health service in England is indeed on the way to becoming a US healthcare system, that would have damaging consequences for Scotland. Private money replaces public funding of the NHS in England. That will trigger cuts to public services funding in Scotland. So budget pressures and cuts in England from privatisation will lead to financial pressures in Scotland. So far from a no vote protecting the institutions that we value, a no vote actually, by keeping them at the mercy of Westminster decisions, places them under more threat. And it's not just a case, as Labour would have us believe, of crossing our fingers and hoping for a different Westminster government. In truth, there is very little to choose between the different Westminster parties on these issues. It was Labour that enthusiastically embraced the market in healthcare, the private finance initiative, and it's Labour today that says it will be just as tough, if not tougher, than the Tories on welfare. So we look at Westminster and we see it offering no real alternative for those in Scotland or indeed elsewhere in the UK who want a different approach. And the Westminster way might work for some, it does work for some, but it isn't working for the majority of people in Scotland, and it's for that majority that the Yes campaign seeks to speak up for the tens of thousands of children who are facing a childhood of poverty because of attacks on social security, for the pensioners who struggle to heat their homes in winter in our energy-rich country, for the working families whose already low incomes have been hit hard, for the mothers who can't get back to work because they're paying some of the highest childcare costs in Europe, for the small businesses who need a competitive edge to get ahead and create jobs and grow their business. These are the people for whom a yes vote offers an alternative to the Westminster way. Now, an independent Scotland clearly won't get everything right. We will face challenges, we'll make our fair share of mistakes, but the fact is independence offers us the best, indeed I would say the only way of doing things differently. I don't hold to the notion that we in Scotland have got a higher set of values than people elsewhere. I think that's nonsense. We do have values, a strong sense of community and social justice, and that doesn't make us unique. What does make us unique this year is that we've got a chance to stand up for those principles of community and social justice, to equip ourselves with the powers to protect them and promote them. We've got a chance to choose our own path, an opportunity to steer a different course. We've got a chance in the years that follow a yes vote to prove that the post-war settlement doesn't need to be a thing of the past, that social justice and enterprise are two sides of the same coin, that more equal societies really do result in more prosperous economies. And by showing that things can be done differently, by demonstrating that the Westminster way is not the only way, just as we've done with the limited powers that the Scottish Parliament has already, I believe that an independent Scotland can offer a positive example to those elsewhere in the UK who are also being let down by the status quo, indeed to all those who yearn for progressive change as much as we do. I said at the outset of my remarks that the decision we take in September will affect our friends, our relatives, our neighbours who live in other parts of the United Kingdom, and it will. But I do believe that effect will be positive, and not just in the way I've already described. I also believe passionately that independence will create a healthier relationship between Scotland and the other nations of our islands. With independence, Scotland will no longer be able to do what we do all too often, blame London for things that go wrong. Responsibility for our successes as well as our mistakes will rest with us, and the rest of the UK will no longer be able to express concern, albeit unfounded, that Scotland is in some way being subsidised. Scotland and the rest of the UK will both stand on our own 2 feet. We will take our own decisions and work together on issues of common interest. Our relationship will be what it always should have been, a partnership of equals. Full powers in Scotland and an equal relationship with our friends and neighbours. I think that is the best of both worlds. And we don't have to look too far away to see examples of successful cooperation between neighbours. You know, the Nordic Council has representatives from Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, as well as from Greenland, the Faroes, Åland. In 2012, it celebrated its 60th anniversary. They commissioned a report to mark that anniversary, and it noted that one reason the Council works is that the people of the 5 Nordic nations share culture, values and a sense of affinity. For these islands, even under devolution, we can already see the outlines of how a renewed partnership of the Isles would work. The British Irish Council, set up in 1998, its secretariat is based in Edinburgh. It's got representatives from 2 independent states, 3 devolved administrations and 3 Crown dependencies. It's not too difficult to see how it could be adapted to include 3 independent nations rather than 2. And of course, in addition to formal mechanisms for cooperation, we would work together on a day-to-day basis, just as we already do in areas where we already have independent powers in Scotland. I remember well when I was Scottish Health Secretary during the swine flu crisis. I worked closely and constructively on a day-to-day, sometimes hour-to-hour basis with colleagues in other UK administrations to ensure a coordinated response. That's what good neighbours do. And Scotland and the rest of the UK will always be more than just good neighbours. We're allies, we're friends, we are family. When David Cameron visited Ireland back in early 2012, he and the Taoiseach produced a joint declaration, and it said this: the relationship between our two countries has never been stronger or more settled, as complex or as important as it is today. Our citizens, uniquely linked by geography and history, are connected today as never before through business, politics, culture and sport, travel and technology, and of course family ties. Our two economies benefit from a flow of people, goods, investment, capital and ideas on a scale that is rare, even in this era of global economic integration. That statement could easily apply to an independent Scotland and its relationship with the other nations of these islands. You will be our closest friends as well as our closest neighbours. And my last point really is just to stress this: independence is not and never has been about walking away from anyone. Independence is about taking responsibility. It's about making our own decisions, but it's also about working together with other nations in the United Nations, in NATO, in the European Union, in the British Irish Council, in the Commonwealth, and in many other organisations. But crucially, it's about working together as an equal partner. In September, we in Scotland face a choice of two futures. We can opt to continue to make up less than a tenth of the MPs in a Parliament whose decisions on welfare, defence and the economy often disregard our wishes and yet affect key aspects of our lives. We can continue to go without the full range of fiscal powers we need to shape our own future. Or we can choose to become a truly equal partner through independence, reclaiming the powers we need to meet our aspirations, but also play our full part together with our closest allies, neighbours and friends in a renewed, stronger, positive partnership of these isles. The latter is what independence in an interdependent world is all about. Thank you very much indeed.